Force majeure is a common clause in contracts which essentially frees both parties from liability or obligation when an extraordinary event or circumstance beyond the control of the parties, such as a war, strike, riot, crime, epidemic or sudden legal changes, prevents one or both parties from fulfilling their obligations under the contract, explicitly excluded as any event described as an act of God, which covers a separate domain and legally differs. Yet it is still related to contract law. In practice, most force majeure clauses do not excuse a party's non-performance entirely but only suspend it for the duration of the force majeure. Force majeure is generally intended to include occurrences beyond the reasonable control of a party, and therefore would not cover. Under international law, it refers to an irresistible force or unforeseen event beyond the control of a state, making it materially impossible to fulfill an international obligation. Accordingly, it is related to the concept of a state of emergency. Force majeure in any given situation is controlled by the law governing the contract, rather than general concepts of force majeure. Contracts often specify what constitutes force majeure via a clause in the agreement. So, the liability is decided per contract and not by statute nor principles of general law. The first step to assess whether and how force majeure applies to any particular contract is to ascertain the law of the country which governs the contract. Time-critical and other sensitive contracts may be drafted to limit the shield of this clause where a party does not take reasonable steps to prevent or limit the effects of the outside interference, either when they become likely or when they actually occur. A force majeure may work to excuse all or part of the obligations of one or both parties. For example, a strike might prevent timely delivery of goods, but not timely payment for the portion delivered. A force majeure may also be the overpowering force itself, which prevents the fulfillment of a contract. In that instance, it is actually the impossibility or impracticability defenses. In the military, force majeure has a slightly different meaning. It refers to an event, either external or internal, that happens to a vessel or aircraft that allows it to enter normally restricted areas without penalty. An example would be the Hainan Island incident where a U.S. Navy aircraft landed at a Chinese military air base after a collision with a Chinese fighter in April 2001. Under the principle of force majeure, the aircraft must be allowed to land without interference. The importance of the force majeure clause in a contract, particularly one of any length in time, cannot be overstated as it relieves a party from an obligation under the contract. What is permitted to be a force majeure event or circumstance can be the source of much controversy in the negotiation of a contract, and a party should generally resist any attempt by the other party to include something that should fundamentally be at the risk of that other party. For example, in a coal supply agreement, the mining company may seek to have geological risk included as a force majeure event. However, the mining company should be doing extensive exploration and analysis of its geological reserves, and should not even be negotiating a coal supply agreement if it cannot take the risk that there may be a geological limit to its coal supply from time to time. The outcome of that negotiation, of course, depends on the relative bargaining power of the parties, and there will be cases where force majeure clauses can be used by a party effectively to escape liability for bad performance. Because of the different interpretations of force majeure across legal systems, it is common for contracts to include specific definitions of force majeure, particularly at the international level. Some systems limit force majeure to an act of God but exclude human or technical failures. The advisory point is in drafting of contract make distinction between act of God and other shape of force majeure. As a consequence, force majeure in areas prone to natural disaster requires a definition of the magnitude of the event for which force majeure could be considered as such in a contract. As an example, in a highly seismic area, a technical definition of the amplitude of motion at the site could be established on the contract, based for example on probability of occurrence studies. This parameter or parameters can later be monitored at the construction site. An earthquake could be a small shaking or damaging event. The occurrence of an earthquake does not imply the occurrence of damage or disruption. For small and moderate events, it is reasonable to establish requirements for the contract processes. For large events, it is not always feasible or economical to do so. Concepts such as damaging earthquake in force majeure clauses do not help to clarify disruption.